It says, ideally, one should build your sukkah immediately after Motzei Yom Kippur, so that one goes from one mitzvah to another. And what it also says is that although it's permitted for any person to place schach on the sukkah, it's preferable to be stringent to have an adult Jewish male place it on the sukkah. Others hold that it is totally permitted to have women or children put up a sukkah, but the schach should be placed by an adult. That I've never heard before. This is from Halachapedia. If one appoints a shaliach, an agent, to build their sukkah, it is proper to say to them, "You are my agent to do the mitzvah of putting up my sukkah and schach for the mitzvah." And that's obviously be older people who want a sukkah. That's the way to go. Then the next section is the minimum amount of walls one requires is 3 walls, and of a length of 7 tvachim, which is 7 handbreadths, 7 fists basically, or fist is a tefach, as we've learned before. And the third wall, it's possible to build the third wall without it being as complete. So it can be 2 full walls and a part of a third wall. Then that's a valid sukkah, and the minimum height is 10 tefachim actually. I mean, that's and these sukkahs did actually exist. I heard a story once. I mean, 10 tefachim is like very basically you have to lie on your back. During the Shoah, during the Holocaust, people that wanted to build a sukkah and didn't want to be noticed by the Nazis, Yamach Shemo, Mezichron, did that so that they could fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah and not be noticed and not cause any suspicion because of such a low height. So it was done. It's not just a concept. So, but then the maximum height for a sukkah is 20 amot, which is 10 meters. Because if it's too high, if a sukkah is too high, you won't have the effect of the shade. There has to be more shade than light in the sukkah. So if it's too high, the light will be more than the shade in the sukkah.
Can you use that sukkah that's too high at night then?
Yeah, maybe that might be an idea actually.
Second time, not well deserved, but anyway, nonetheless, let's go.
So, guys, we were talking about Rav and Rav Papa. So, Rav is of the opinion that if there's a borrower who dies, then his heirs are obligated, if there is real fixed property, in the event of an either unavoidable mishap, or if the heirs happen to slaughter and eat the meat, according to some opinions, because he holds that at the time that the borrower had fixed property, there was a guarantee given to the lender that any mishap that occurred, and an unavoidable one at that, which the animal happens to die, etc., he will make good on that. So if he doesn't have the cash equivalent and he can't bring back the animal, then the lien occurs on the fixed property, and the value of that animal will be taken out of fixed property. So even if the unavoidable mishap happens after the borrower's death, the lien was created in the borrower's lifetime, because all borrowers are responsible for unavoidable mishaps. So that is if there is fixed property. If there's none, there's no liability for unavoidable mishaps, according to Rava. According to the Rosh, there should be, because the lender goes into a new arrangement with the heirs and says, if you want to carry on getting the benefit of the borrowed item, you're obligated, same as your father, the borrower, when he was alive. As far as slaughtering and eating the animal is concerned, they're 2/3 of the value, which is at the cheaper market-related rate, because we deem at that sort of special price, even the poorer would take advantage of that opportunity and have the meat for Shabbos. And it's not fair to the lender to have to take a complete dive on it, especially since the human intervention created the animal's death, and it was the father's negligence in not informing his children as to what he borrowed, what he owns, and what he owes. And therefore, that negligence is almost the equivalent of smacking into a stranger's vehicle with your vehicle. Is you're liable. You're liable for the damage. It's different to the animal happening to drop dead whilst it's in your possession. Now, it brings up this case of the Gemara that says, listen, as far as the liability on fixed property is concerned, does it mean that with the unavoidable mishap, it is real property, you're obligated for that? Or is it only a case of human intervention, of negligence, of slaughtering and eating the animal, that there's liability of the full price, not that 2/3 of the rate, as far as the latter statement is concerned? And we say the opinions that both, those that view that the heirs are responsible for the unavoidable mishap, most certainly say when there's human intervention and that causes the animal's death, there's liability. And the others that say, with the second opinion, that it's only when there's human negligence where the animal is damaged that there's liability, that it doesn't mean that the aforementioned statement that liability occurs in the event of an unavoidable mishap, and we could still hold like Rava, not like the Rosh. But Rav Papa is saying that in either event, there's a difficulty, because he says that as far as an unavoidable mishap is concerned, it is only judged at the timeline at which the heirs had the unfortunate incident of the animal dying on their watch when they borrowed the animal. And therefore, they're not under the obligation, according to Rav Papa, not according to Rav Papa, but according to Rava, using Rav Papa's timeline, if you want to say that it's taken at the time point at which the incident occurred, and not while the borrower was alive at the previous timeline of the lien and the contract when it was first taken up with the lender. So this is not Rav Papa's opinions. It's mainly using Rav Papa's timeline to show that liability is waived because the heirs haven't taken under the contractual obligation of the initial borrower. All right, so now that you understand this, it's bringing a case of another incident at which Rav Papa talks about timelines. So what incident is this? Well, Rav Papa said if one had in his possession a cow that was stolen by him before the Sabbath, and then he slaughtered it on the Sabbath, he is liable to the fivefold payment, because he has already become liable for committing theft before he came to the point of transgressing. Sorry, guys, I'm tongue-tied. My blood sugar's a bit low. To the point of transgressing the Sabbath prohibition. So let's unpack what this means. So there's a concept of kimle b'di rabba mineh. Now, Kevin, what is that concept?
Okay, so can I give an example so that it's an easy way to explain it? So if there are two penalties, and one happens to be the death penalty, and the other penalty or punishment is a fine, the fine falls away because the death penalty is more severe, and that takes precedence. Okay, explain it one more time so I understand if you're missing. Okay, so if the two punishments or two penalty, if there's a fine, a knas, or a penalty, and the penalty is the death penalty, that overrides the fine of double payment, and the death penalty will be given to the person. The person won't have to make the payment; that they'll get the death penalty. Okay, so you are pretty accurate in some respects, and in some respects we just need a bit of tweaking. So let me explain to you the exact definition of kimle b'di rabba mineh. Kevin, you're very, very close, and you're accurate to a large degree. It means he stands liable to the penalty greater than it. So what are we saying here is that it's when an incident occurs where the transgressor commits
two transgressions simultaneously at one time juncture, then Kimle B'di Rabba Minei kicks in. So, for example, if somebody burns a Picasso on Shabbat when there were two witnesses, and there was Hazroah, which is warnings, and then breaking Shabbat on purpose is a capital offense, then that 20 million rand compensation for the value loss of the Picasso is waived because the transgressor is already getting the death penalty. Okay, but that's a simultaneous act. That's number one. In a case where it's maybe not a simultaneous act, but the transgressor might have done two different death penalties. So, for example, he murdered, and then he committed either idolatry or he had incestuous relationships, at which there are two different death penalties. The more severe death penalty is given. Why? Because it basically takes into account the atonement, the kapora, for the greater death penalty and the lesser death penalty, because you can only kill a person once. So therefore, the more severe death penalty covers both both capital offences. Okay, so that's on non-simultaneous timeline acts. And one of the issues that you've got to know about Kimle B'di Rabba Minei, where there's a slight mistake you made, is in the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as explained by Rabba, that this rule pertains only to regular monetary liabilities and not to knasot, fines. What are fines? They're punitive payments that do not compensate for the actual loss. So, for example, such fines include the kefil payment, as well as the extra 3 payments that must be made for stealing a cow or an ox, etc. So what we are saying is, firstly, Kimle B'di Rabba Minei occurs when the amount is compensatory and not a fine by nature. So anything that's a knas, a fine, or as we call it, a penalty, but the word fine is better, you still pay if it occurs simultaneously with a greater punishment, like a kefil payment, as far as that's concerned, but not for a compensatory amount which is waived for a greater penalty. One of the other penalties that you might be dealing with is you've got 3 main categories. You've got capital punishment, which is a death penalty. You've got corporal punishment, which are lashes, and you've got monetary payments. And monetary payments consist of compensatory amounts. Or if you steal 100 zuz, you pay 100 zuz. And then you've got knesset, which are fines, which are penalties over and above that. So if you say there's a biblical prohibition which says you shall pay double for theft, not for robbery, but for theft, you pay the principal amount and the fine equivalent to the principal amount. But the fine aspect is not waived for Kimle B'di Rabba Minei. So here, if you want to work according to Rav Papa's timeline, it should be, if you're taking Rav's timeline where everything is judged at the end point. Well, if you're judging it at the end point, then the financial payment should be waived in effect of the death penalty. So let me just put it to you like this. So if the monetary obligation occurred at the same time as a death penalty offense, the monetary obligation is waived. But here there are 2 parts, because if you have a look at the biblical prohibition, he shall pay double relates to any article that a thief steals. Like he steals a laptop, he has to pay the value of the laptop, and the penalty is equivalent to the compensatory amount. But if you steal an ox or a sheep, for an ox it's 4-fold, which is the compensatory amount, and the penalty is 3 times the amount of the principal, equals 4 times. If you're looking at if you're looking at a sheep, it's 3 times the penalty and 1 time compensatory amount, so that's 4 times. And if you look at an ox, it's 5 times, which, as we learned, was 4 times the penalty and 1 time the compensatory amount equals 5. on the principal amount. Why? Because we said whenever you steal a sheep, there's humiliation in terms of that you have to lift it over your shoulders, it stinks, etc., and that performs some slight kapora, so that you're paying 4 times and not 5 times compared to an ox. It's not a weight issue of the animal because that's pro rata to the weight. We also said, like, this issue is there 2 injunctions, and the first one is stealing the animal. The second one is slaughtering or selling it. So when did the theft take place? The theft took place before Shabbat. So according to Rav Papa, the actual compensation took place on a Thursday when the animal was stolen. So that's not at the same time that the animal was slaughtered, and therefore Kimle B'di Rabba Mineh does not kick in. So even if he gets the death penalty for breaking Shabbat, as far as the compensatory amount, that was done on Thursday, so he still would have to pay that. That's not waived in favor of the greater penalty, Evan. Now, then we've got an issue with regards to slaughtering the animal. If it's an ox, it's 4 times the amount because the principal was already paid for the damage on Thursday. So you're saying, but that occurs at the same time as when he made the transgression of breaking Shabbat with warning, with witnesses, when it's a death penalty offense. So why isn't that amount waived as well? And we said, we said that Rabbi Meir in the case of Rava has got a slightly different issue, because according to Rava, it's only ordinary monetary liabilities for compensation. So what are the 4 penalty? What is the 4 times penalty payment? That's a knas. That's a penalty. So that's not compensatory. So according to Rabba, it's not waived for Kimle B'di Rabba Mineh. And when was the animal slaughtered? On Shabbat. So therefore, since the actual stolen amount, which is he shall pay double, is done on the Thursday, and the slaughtering or the selling of the animal is invoked with the penalty amount, penalties are not waived for Kimle B'di Rabba Mineh. So you might turn around and say, I don't know what your argument would be, but that's exactly why, as far as Rav Papa is concerned, based on the timeline, based on the difference between the compensatory amount and the penalty, there is already financial obligation, irrespective of whether there's Kimle B'di Rabba Mineh for transgressing the Shabbos prohibition. Any questions?
Can I just stop you for 1 second? Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you. Yeah. Good timing. So what I want to ask you is, if he stole the sheep and slaughtered it on a Saturday, then he pays only the penalty, I would presume, the 4 times. Let's say it's an ox. He pays 4 times for the ox, but the 1 times compensation that gets waived because he's got the death penalty. Am I right? That's what I'm thinking you say.
So that's exactly what I'm saying, which is why that's exactly what I'm saying, is because the Gemara is saying the cow was stolen before Shabbat and then he slaughtered on the Shabbos. So Gavin's got the concept perfectly. And by the way, if you want to look at the Gemara in Kesubos 36b, that's where the entire discussion is there. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah. No, thanks. I just wanted to just clarify that, because that's a slightly different example to yours. And as long as I'm understanding it correctly, it sounds like I am.
Yeah, you are. Now,
thanks.
There's a separate issue, and that is what happens if you don't have a thief, but you've got a borrower. So if one had in his possession, for example, a borrowed cow, and he slaughtered it on Shabbat, he's not liable to pay anything. Why?
Because it's a principle and Shabbat, so the Shabbat supersedes it. So Kivle, I can't pronounce it, kicks in.
Exactly. So the liability for transgressing the Shabbat prohibition, and his liability for transgressing the prohibition of theft occurred simultaneously. In other words, unlike a thief who incurs liability to pay the stolen object when he in fact steals it, a borrower does never have to incur liability to pay the borrowed object, and should it become unreturnable when he borrows it. Only if he borrowed the item and it suffers damage or loss that rendered it unreturnable does he become liable. But as Gavin said, in this case where the borrower slaughtered the cow, incurred liability at the time of the slaughter. So he became liable to payment at the same time as he became liable to capital punishment for Shabbat desecration. So the rule of Kimle B'dirabba Mineh exempts him from having to pay, because a borrower just has to replace that which he stole, and there's no penalty. He's a borrower. He never stole the object, he just has to replace it. So Rashi is saying that a borrower is never liable to kefil because he's not stealing the borrowed object. He's not liable to the fivefold payment. It's not a different timeline. So basically, there's no issue as far as that's concerned. The only time that this occurs is to an unpaid custodian who would be exempt if he was to make a claim of theft. But a borrower is liable for theft. Do you get what I'm saying? Because he's not, you're doing him a favor by lending him the object. So he's much more liable than even an unpaid custodian. Why? Because, okay, you're not paying the unpaid custodian, but he doesn't need the objects he's looking after for you. So a borrower and a paid custodian, by contrast, can't exempt themselves by claiming theft. Why? Because a paid custodian is getting a benefit and a borrower is getting the benefit because he's getting the object. So they are liable for mishaps of any of that sort of nature, theft, etc. So there's never a situation where a borrower or paid custodian would be liable to kefil or the fivefold payment. And therefore, it's only a compensatory amount. And if that's taken at the same time where the object is actually slaughtered on Shabbat, he doesn't have to pay the compensation because he's getting the death penalty. Okay, so let's deal with the next issue. We learned in our Mishnah and the Brysas above that one who consumes property which was stolen by someone else is not obligated to reimburse the owner. And the Brysa gives a scriptural source for the law, which the rabbis taught. The Torah states in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 5, verse 23, and he shall return the robbed article that he robbed. Now, there's a superfluous word in there. You can either say, and he shall return the robbed article. It's clear. Or you can say, and he shall return that which he robbed. It's clear. By having the word robbed article that he robbed, it's superfluous. So the statement is there to teach us something else, because the Torah never wastes words. So basically, what does the verse mean to teach when it states that he robbed? It means that he shall return the stolen object in the same state when he robbed it. So that implies a couple of things, that if there's any physical change, the robber acquires acquisition of that object and has to pay the financial equivalent. If he had a physical change, a change of name, a change of domain, etc. Now, we are saying if the object disappears because the guy consumed it, the third party is not liable. The robber, if he consumes it or damages it, is the one who stole it, and therefore there is liability. Right. So, a third party needn't even pay monetary value, but the robber himself has to, but he can't bring an object back that's been already consumed. Now, what did we learn about Rav Chisda? That he limits the exemption to where the sons consumed the article after the owner reached Yeush when they inherited it, after Yeush. But Rami Bava Kamma applies it even when they consumed the article before Yeush, because it's not in existence, there's nothing to return. And it's the third party, it's the sons. So based on what did the sages say, if one robs something and feeds it to his children, they are not liable to pay for it because the article no longer exists and they were not the ones who stole it. And if he left the stolen article before them intact as an inheritance, whether they are adults or minors, they are liable to return it. Now, Obviously, as long as the article still exists, even if the robber's children or another third party have it, they're obligated to return an intact object. Now, this goes against Sumchus, because what did Sumchus says? He says if the heirs are adults, they are liable to return the article intact, but if they are minors, they are not liable to return it. And we said the reason being is that minors can't be sued in a court of law. Now, not everybody agrees with Sumchus's opinion. Other people say that a minor might not be able to be sued, but if the article is intact, the minors certainly have to return it just as adults. It doesn't entitle them to keep it. So the Gemara is going to bring this incident at where the preceding dispute applies. Okay? So, guys, let me just explain to you what incident we're talking about. So we have the minor son of Rav Yirmiyah, father-in-law. I don't think we discussed this issue of Rav Yirmiyah. So Rav Yirmiyah, he had a son that was underage, and Rav Yirmiyah's father-in-law closed the door of his father's house in the face of Rav Yirmiyah. In other words, what are we saying is the son didn't allow Rav Yirmiyah to enter the house because he thought he wanted to take possession of it. So what happened was Rav Yirmiyah claimed that his father-in-law had sold him the house, or actually had given it to him as a gift. But the father-in-law's son, that was under 18, in this case, call it a minor, let's say for all disputed arguments, under 12, attempted to prevent Rav Yirmiyah from entering the house, asserting actually, guys, that the property was his because he had inherited it from his father. So what happened is, just hang on a second, guys, I'm just pausing the share a sec.
But I think the three of us also have a blood sugar problem because we can't pronounce anything either.
Okay. Okay, so
I'm
what is
just
this preceding dispute? The minor son of Rav Yirmiyah's father-in-law closed the door of his father's house in the face of Rav Yirmiyah, and he did not allow Rav Yirmiyah to enter the house because Rav Yirmiyah wanted to take possession of it. So what did we say? Rav Yirmiyah claimed that his father-in-law had sold him the house or given it to him as a gift. However, the father-in-law's son that was under 12 attempted to prevent Rav Yirmiyah from entering the house, asserting that the property was in fact his as an inheritance from his father. So what happened is the case went before Rav Yavin, and Rav Yirmiyah said he's claiming that which is his, meaning that since we know that the house belonged to the father-in-law, and since this boy is the father-in-law's heir, he's acting within his rights to prevent you from taking the house. So Rav Yavin is actually going in favor of the son, who said he was right to lock the door in your face. He knew that if you stood on the land, you would want to take it. So Rav Yirmiyah wasn't happy, and he said, listen, I'm going to produce witnesses who would testify that I had established a chazaka with respect to the house when the father was alive. So what are we saying is, what's a chazaka, Gavin? We did this already.
Chazaka. Kevin's good with this. Kevin, do you remember?
Would there be some issue with the strength or something? Or
Well, chazak is strength, it is for sure, but
Yes, so that's right. Also, chazak means it's a strength, but it's a strength that gives somebody what? An ownership right. So what happens is if
yes,
for 3 years a person occupies a property, we did this a bit in Bava Basra, that was hitherto known to belong to someone else, and the original owner did not contest his occupancy during that entire period, the occupant thereby establishes a presumption of ownership, chazaka. Okay, so in other words, if you sit in a seat 3 times a shul and nobody objects, then that seat is yours. It's acquisition for a 3-time usage. In regards to a property, 3 years. And as long as the original owner doesn't contest the occupancy, during the entire period, and therefore it establishes, as we said, a presumption of ownership. Now, my question on this chazaka is, what if you're renting for 3 years? How does that mean you own the place? But anyway, that's not the scope of the discussion. Maybe there are different arrangements then.
Maybe that's excluded in the rental agreement. It's mentioned there that you can't take, that by default, chazaka can't take place.
Okay, so the problem is there isn't a rental agreement, because what Rav Yirmiyah is saying here,
Hold on.
yeah,
Hold on. With the rental agreement, okay, you have a rental thing that is not yours. So even if you did 10 years, doesn't make a difference. It's still not yours because you have a written agreement saying it belongs to somebody else.
you're 100% right. That's how we do it now.
Something that nobody has any protesting of.
So, mate, you're 100% right. That's how we do it now. But in Bava Basra 28a, you can successfully claim, and this is the important thing back then, that the previous owner had sold or given him the property. So it says in Bava Basra 28a, the fact that he cannot produce a deed of sale or witnesses to a sale or a rental agreement does not disprove his claim, because a person is not expected to keep deeds for more than 3 years. So that's a difficulty, because today you keep documents for 20 years or 30 years. It doesn't matter, because you might come to have to prove it. And number two, it seems as though you don't need to produce a deed of sale or witnesses to the sale. You just have to be there 3 years without it being contested. But my question is, why wouldn't they see it as a rental agreement? So I don't know. Anyway, Rav Yirmiyah did not have a deed to show. That's what the Gemara says, that his father-in-law had sold or given him the house. But he contended, however, that he could present witnesses to testify that he actually lived there for 3 years in the lifetime of the father-in-law, in which case he could enjoy a presumption of ownership. And obviously that the occupancy would have to take place in his father-in-law's lifetime, because if there was a 3-year period and he only served 2 of it before his father-in-law's death, he wouldn't have established ownership, and that's in Ketubot 17b. So Rav Avin said to him, and this is the big thing, he says, but do we accept the testimony of witnesses in the absence of the litigant against whom they're testifying? We do not. So what he's saying is, if you've got witnesses and they testify against somebody when he's not present, their testimony is invalid, saying that at the end of the day, the father-in-law is not alive, and the son, you can't come with witnesses without the minor son being there. So for that reason, we can't accept testimony against a minor, because a minor is the legal equivalent of one who is absent. And this is very, very important. We say that 3 people are not obligated legally. And those 3 people are, number one, people that are insane, mentally competent, deaf, mutes, insane. Just hang on a second. I just need to pause this here a second. So what he's saying is as follows. If somebody's not mentally competent, they're known as absent. And since they're absent, you can't bring witnesses there when a person is not there to understand what testimony is against them. So if the defendant is absent or the plaintiff is absent, there is no court case. So if somebody is not considered an adult, they are mentally absent from the case. So how can you bring witnesses in the absence of the litigant who is compos mentis? And therefore we cannot accept testimony against a minor, because a minor is the legal equivalent of one who is absent. Okay? So Rav Yirmiyah countered, and do we not accept testimony against a minor? What does he mean? He says, like, there are cases where we don't agree with Rav Sumkos, and we do accept testimony against a minor, because there's a brisa that teaches to the contrary, and it says, look, if a thief died and left stolen property, whether his heirs are adults or minors, they are liable to return it to the owner. Evidently, a minor can be compelled to return property that is not his. Okay, and this is what we learned in the case of a thief, and the article is still intact. That's why this whole brisa was brought. So Rabbi Avin's reply to him is that, listen, okay, so the dissenting opinion of Sumkos is at your side in the brisa you quoted. Sumkos states that a minor may not be sued. Okay. In other words, Rav Avin ruled in accordance with Sumchus, and that Manas can't be sued. But Rav Yirmiyah is saying, listen, not everybody took pains to adopt Sumchus's position to take away that which is mine. So he's saying to Rabbi Avin, okay, so Sumchus is a minor opinion compared to the majority halachic opinion of the sages, and then you intend to spite me by adopting a minor view of Sumchus in comparison to the general rabbinic opinion. That's not fair. So the Gemara says eventually the matter circled and reached the attention of Rav Abahu, okay? Because Rav Avin could see it from Rav Yirmiyah's point of view, and he couldn't quite decide how to rule the case. So it went before the Academy of Rav Abahu, and then there were scholars that debated the matter and reached a conclusion, and the Gemara says that basically, have you not heard of that which Rav Yosef Bava Kamma said in the name of Rav Oshia? For Rav Yosef Bava Kamma said in the name of Rav Oshia, if a miner took his slaves, entered the field of his fellow and said, it's mine, we don't say to him, let's wait until you reach adulthood. Rather, if he took the property legally and he took slaves, what we mean is he took like 10 henchmen and took over the property and said, well, it's technically mine. We're not going to wait till he reach his adulthood to be able to extract the property from him. We actually take it away from him unless he brings witnesses that can prove that the property is his. You can't bring slaves or people who hired as henchmen to take over the property. So whether he's a minor or adult, we don't allow him to use his status to intimidate and take over property. So in Rav Yirmiyah's case as well, the court is satisfied that the evidence is sufficient, and even though he's a minor, it should decide in favor, although his opponent might be a minor, as long as there's a legitimate case. And we're going to end off on, we need about 3 minutes, we're going to deal with this issue, because the analogy the Gemara counters between Rav Oshia's ruling and Rav Yirmiyah's case are very different. They're not even comparable. Why? In Rav Oshia's ruling, we take the field away from a minor because he does not enjoy an assumption of ownership of his father. He basically sent henchmen to go and take over a property, and it has nothing to do with the fact that he could have owned it. The minor can't prove that it was hereditarily part of his late father. It's just some property of which he's arguing, but it's a different case according to this issue with Rav Miriyahu. Why? Because where the minor does enjoy an assumption of ownership of his father, in other words, everybody knew his father owned it, there was evidence to suggest that we can't take the disputed property away from him, because there is a legal precedence that there was evidence that it belonged to his father and he should inherit it. So in Rav Yirmiyah's case, the house wasn't known to have belonged to the miner's father. Was actually known to belong to the miner's father. So there is some basis to the miner's claim that he inherited the house. And the court can't evict him. And when the boy reaches adulthood, Rav Yirmiyah is able to sue him as a legally present compos mentis witness. But in the case where the miner sent slaves to go and evict the owner from the field, there's no evidence as to the fact that it belonged to him in any event. So they're two very, very different cases. All right, guys, I'm done. All right, guys, lovely to see you.
Yeah.
Be sealed for a good year. We'll see you tomorrow at 5:30.
Amen.
Yeah, 5:30 or
5
5?
o'clock. Is it 5 o'clock, Kev? 5.
I think he said
Yeah.
5.
5. I'll see you at 5.
This